Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Election season is upon us, and it's not just all national politics and the presidential election. Here in Washington, there's a big governor's race, and joining us to talk about some of the dynamics there is Austin Jenkins. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
Thanks for having me.
So, Austin, Governor Jay Inslee running for a rare third term, and running against him is Loren Culp. Of course, coming out of the primary, that I don't know if that was considered a surprise, but there were some other high-profile candidates, and Loren Culp made it through. So let's just straight talk. What are Loren Culp's chances?
I think he has quite an uphill battle to climb. He's a first-time candidate. He comes from remote Northeast Washington as opposed to the vote-rich Central Puget Sound. Not well-known statewide, and he's certainly running about a 6-to-1 deficit in terms of fundraising compared to the governor, the incumbent governor. So this is not an easy road to hoe in the coming weeks.
Right, and of course we should note that it's not just been years but decades since a Republican has won the governor's seat in Washington state. I wonder though, from your reading of the primary results from August, there was a packed field for governor, 36 people on the ballot. Of course, Washington system, top two people go to the general election regardless of party. So of course, Jay Inslee is that Democrat, and there was a big field of Republicans, probably only about 5 of which were really had a chance in terms of their fundraising and their recognition on the ballot from the campaign season. Loren Culp is the person, of course, who made it through. And I wonder if there's any possibility that he made it through because those other candidates who were sort of higher profile, let's say those 4 others, they were a little more moderate, and that sort of split the moderate vote. And so all the rest of the votes, the more conservative vote, all coalesced around Loren Culp, and that's sort of how he made it through. Is that a proper reading of those?
Well, it's certainly clear that he got into the top 2 with just 17% of the vote. So there was a lot of divvying up of the votes for Republican candidates. I think what's clear is that Loren Culp, for all of the perhaps challenges and deficits he has as a first-time candidate, also has a lot going for him, in as much as he seems to have really galvanized grassroots support, especially among fierce Second Amendment supporters. He got a lot of attention in 2018 when he refused to enforce the gun measure that raised the age from 18 to 21 to purchase a semi-automatic rifle. And when he did that, he got national attention. He also wrote a book, and he went on this speaking tour. He was going around to Republican Party Lincoln Day dinners, and he got his name out there. And just yard signs alone certainly don't win you an election, but when you see them in the concentration you do for him in so many parts of the state, it just shows you that there's an energy there among his base, his chief supporters. The challenge is, how do you scale that? How do you then appeal to independent and maybe even Democratic voters who are soft Democratic voters in more suburban parts of the state, especially when you're not well known? That's the challenge he faces. But clearly, he has a very energized base of support in this election.
You, of course, have spoken recently to Mr. Culp, as have other reporters, and that we've profiled some of those conversations that they've had during this primary season, and we won't rehash all of the previous conversations we have. But in your conversation with him and just generally following the campaign, what is his pitch generally to voters? Why should people back him rather than Jay Inslee?
Well, he is certainly portraying himself as the counter to Inslee. So, for instance, he opposes the governor's stay-home order and the governor's mask order. In fact, he's going around the state holding rallies in defiance of the governor's orders, and he calls them victory protests, not even rallies. So, a lot of what he's doing is providing that contrast to what the governor is doing, and running a campaign that is about criticizing the governor's actions on COVID. He wants to cast himself as the law and order candidate, as somebody who is standing up for individual freedom and noting, referring often to the Constitution, talking about the fact that the people are not subject to government, but government is subject to the people. You hear a lot of that rhetoric. And certainly he's burnishing his credentials as a Second Amendment supporter. So, you package all of that together, and he is the anti-Inslee candidate in this race for sure.
That all seems well and good, and you'd expect that from anyone running against the incumbent. They were going to be the incumbent, right? And that message plays well in more rural areas, of course, as it always would. And just being here in Eastern Washington, I've driven through Ferry County and where he lives in Republic recently, and of course, there's many Culp signs and President Trump signs, and not many for any Democratic candidates. So that's pretty much to be expected in any election. So you mentioned it before, but I want to kind of circle back to it. What then is his pitch, though, for people in the Puget Sound region? Because let's be honest, as you noted, the voter base is there, and you cannot win statewide office in Washington by just appealing to people in the more rural areas or Eastern Washington, of course. So the type of voter who is in King County and the Puget Sound region, who is big on climate change policy and Black Lives Matter and police reform and gun control issues, how is he going to attract them?
He's probably not going to win those votes. And as you note, he could win 30 plus counties and still lose the race. I mean, it's not unusual for it's not unusual for Republicans to lose races that Democrats win statewide by just winning, say, 5 key counties. That said, the thing that I would say about Culp trying to appeal more broadly is that if he can pull in, say, the Tim Eyman supporters who maybe vote for Democratic candidates often, but also vote for Tim Eyman anti-tax initiatives and have that sort of independent or libertarian streak about them at times, that could perhaps get him a pool of voters in more suburban areas. I will tell you, though, that Democrats are saying 2 things. One, don't underestimate Loren Culp. And they've analogized that to Trump. Don't underestimate him. And secondly, they are painting and portraying him as not only conservative, but quite radical. And they are criticizing his positions, for instance, on police reform and on climate change, and calling him out for references he's made to and comparisons he's made to the civil rights movement and even the Holocaust in connection with his his stance against the gun initiative. So, to be clear, Democrats are taking him seriously and saying, this populist message, this good government message he may be running on is not the full picture. Meanwhile, his challenge will be to try to have that more mainstream message to voters that, look, this is just about, taking back government for the people. It's about government overreach. And if you want those things, and if that matters to you, then he's going to make the pitch that he's the candidate to vote for. But as I've said, it's not going to be an easy pitch. He doesn't have a lot of money to do it. He doesn't have a lot of time. And again, that kind of fired up base of support probably isn't going to be enough to get him over the finish line.
Can you just speak to a little bit about the kind of Republican that Culp represents statewide, and whether you think that's a little bit of a shift from previous candidates for governor in statewide office? People remember Dino Rossi, Bill Bryant from several years ago. And how does Loren Culp fit into the profile of a statewide nominee for the Republicans?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because he's very different than those candidates, Rob McKenna being another one. And this is a strange year. Part of what happened is that you've got Inslee running for that 3rd term, and we didn't see higher profile incumbent Republican office holders who are often talked about as potential Republican candidates for governor get into the race. So people like Bruce Danmeyer, who's the Pierce County executive, or J.T. Wilcox, the House Republican leader, they took a pass on this. That left kind of a wide open opportunity for anybody to get in, and they did. And to your point, by nominating Loren Culp through the top 2 primary process, you're getting a much more conservative candidate than you would have in the past, which again, when you look at, Democrats would disagree that McKenna or Bryant were moderates, but comparatively, hailing from King County and really understanding that to win a statewide race, they needed to pull over those independents and those soft Democrats. Now you have a much more conservative Northeast Washington police chief in the position of trying to win statewide. The only thing that anybody points to that suggests he could win is that these are strange, unprecedented times, tumultuous times. And we didn't see in the primary evidence of a giant blue wave washing over the state. And we're also a state known for ticket splitting, where voters will vote, one way for president and differently down ballot. But again, the numbers just aren't in his favor. His candidacy, though, is super interesting. And the fact he seems to have galvanized the base of the Republican Party in a way that those other candidates we just talked about haven't in the past. And that's what makes this particularly interesting. His supporters are really enthusiastic and energetic.
Well, we certainly look forward to the coming few weeks of the campaign. And I'll just note that on October 7th, we will air a debate between Loren Culp and Governor Jay Inslee right here on NWPB. That's on October 7th. People can find more information on our website, nwpb.org. Let's continue on the voting topic, however, in terms of how people vote. There was recently some information that people received about how the voting process takes place in Washington state. And the Secretary of State and county auditors who run elections are not too happy with that in terms of what that information was. What was that information, Austin, and why did it go out to all these voters?
Well, the U.S. Postal Service has been in the news a lot lately in the context of vote by mail. There's been reports of them pulling out mail sorting processing equipment, whether they could get ballots to voters on time and get those voters back to county auditors on time. And then what happened is that this postcard was sent out to voters across the country, including here in Washington state. And it was a guide to how to vote by mail. And the thing that was pointed out by the Secretary of State's office is that it talks about the need to request your mail-in ballot at least 15 days before Election Day. But of course, we're an all vote by mail state, so you don't have to request your ballot. It gets mailed out automatically. So there's concern about confusion, this triggering confusion. We're already hearing that there's some calls to county auditors about this. It's been an issue down in Oregon as well. The main message is you can ignore that part of this flyer. You don't need to request your ballot. It is a smart idea to go online and confirm your registration and make sure your voter registration is up to date, your address is up to date, and you can also track your ballot that way. But you don't actually need to request an absentee ballot like you would in some states.
Nor do you need to affix first-class postage because it is okay to mail a ballot without actually putting on a stamp because that is paid for through the state. And I should just note real quickly that people can still vote register to vote up to Election Day in person at a county elections office. Austin Jenkins, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
See more of Austin's reporting on these and other topics at our website, nwpb.org. And while there, you can check out all of our election year news and subscribe to our election year podcast, How We Ended Up Here. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.